It was supposed to be a quiet night, the kind of silence that wraps around you when the world is asleep. Then, at 3 a.m., my doorbell rang. I thought it was a mistake. No one visits at that hour. But when I opened the door, a courier stood there, shivering, holding a small cardboard box. "Delivery for Mrs. Grant," he said, handing it over before disappearing into the fog. My eyes fell on the label, my son's name, written in bold black ink. The same son who vanished 6 months ago. "You won't believe what was inside. I'm glad you're here. Please like the video, subscribe." The clock glowed faintly in the corner. 3:04 a.m. The house was wrapped in silence, the kind that makes you aware of every small sound, the creak of the pipes, the wind brushing against the window, the faint hum of the refrigerator. Then the doorbell rang. Once, then again. Each ring cut through the quiet like a blade. I sat up slowly, unsure if I was dreaming. No one visited at this hour. Not in this neighborhood, not in this weather. The hallway was dim, only a weak light spilling from the lamp I'd forgotten to switch off earlier. I walked toward the front door, every step echoing on the cold floor. Through the small glass panel, I could see a man. Tall, wrapped in a heavy jacket, his breath clouding in the cold. He looked nervous, glancing over his shoulder as though the night itself was watching him. I opened the door a crack, and the wind pushed against it like it wanted to come inside. The man nodded quickly. "Delivery for Mrs. Grant," he muttered, holding out a small brown box. I blinked. "At this hour?" He didn't answer, just shoved a clipboard toward me. His hands trembled. I signed, more out of confusion than understanding. Then he turned, hurried down the porch steps, and disappeared into the fog. The cold air bit at my face as I stood there, staring into the emptiness. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows that stretched across the pavement. Somewhere, a dog barked in the distance. I shut the door and looked down at the package in my hands. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a shoebox. Plain brown paper, a single strip of tape across the top. No return address. And then I saw it, printed neatly in the top left corner. Recipient, Mrs. Evelyn Grant. And below that, sender, Michael Grant. My son. My son who had vanished 6 months earlier without a single word. My heart froze. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring at the name as if it might disappear if I blinked too hard. I placed the box on the table. The house suddenly felt too big, too empty. The clock ticked loudly. I ran my fingers over the tape, feeling the roughness beneath my skin. What could possibly be inside? Why now? Why after all these months of silence, worry, and sleepless nights? 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. Could this be a cruel prank? A mistake? Or something worse? My mind drifted to the last conversation we'd had. Short, strained. He had said he was handling something important, that I shouldn't worry. I had worried anyway. And then he was gone. No goodbye, no phone call, no trace. I turned the box over in my hands, feeling its weight. It wasn't heavy enough to be something mechanical, but there was a faint shifting sound inside, like metal brushing against cardboard. My palms began to sweat. I considered calling the police. But what would I even tell them? That a mother received a box from a missing son? They'd call it coincidence, or worse, pity me with their eyes again. The wind outside howled suddenly, and the porch light flickered. I pulled my robe tighter and sat down at the kitchen table, the box in front of me like an accusation. The air smelled faintly of dust and old coffee. I tried to steady my breathing, but every second that passed made my hands tremble harder. I reached for a knife from the drawer, its metal cold in my fingers. I slid it slowly under the tape, the sound of tearing cardboard filling the silence. The smell of old paper and something faintly metallic drifted out. I stopped. My heart pounded so hard, I could feel it in my throat. For a long moment, I couldn't bring myself to look inside. My hands hovered above the edges. I thought about every nightmare I'd had since his disappearance, of doors knocking in the dark, of voices calling from places I couldn't reach. I thought of the police visits, the missing posters, the neighbors' quiet sympathy. I thought of hope, how it hurts more than loss when it lingers too long. Finally, I took a breath and looked. Inside the box, beneath layers of folded paper, lay something that shimmered faintly in the low light. A small metal key on a keychain. My eyes widened. It wasn't just any key. It was engraved with a name I hadn't seen in decades, and beside it, a flash drive, wrapped carefully in a piece of cloth. My fingers brushed against it, and then I saw it. A folded note, tucked neatly between them. The handwriting was his, my son's, sharp, messy, familiar. My vision blurred for a second as tears gathered, uninvited. I unfolded it slowly, afraid of what the words might say. The first line read, "Mum, if you're reading this, trust only the key." I froze. It wasn't a farewell. It was a beginning. 6 months. That's how long it had been since I last saw my son. The world had moved on, but I hadn't. Every morning began the same way. His photo on the wall, his room untouched, and the faint hope that maybe the phone would ring. It never did. He had left suddenly, saying only that he was handling something important. I didn't ask questions at first. He'd always been independent, secretive, the kind who carried burdens alone. But when the calls stopped, when his friends stopped visiting, and when weeks turned into months, that confidence turned into fear. The police had come and gone. They called it voluntary disappearance. Those were the words they used, as if he had simply decided to vanish, as if a man could walk away from his life, his work, and his mother without reason. They filled out their reports, handed me pamphlets, and promised to keep an eye open. But eyes don't find what hearts lose. After a while, even the neighbors stopped asking. I tried to convince myself he was fine. I imagined him in another city, working, starting over. Sometimes I told myself he just needed space. Maybe he'd come back once he'd figured things out. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. A mother knows the difference between distance and disappearance. In the beginning, I checked his emails. He'd given me his passwords long ago, back when he used to travel for work. The inbox was full of messages from old clients, reminders from banks, subscription renewals. But nothing personal. No trace of a man living his life. The last message sent from his account was dated a week before he vanished. It was a single email to a company I didn't recognize. No subject line, no content except a strange attachment. A locked file I couldn't open. I showed it to the police, but they brushed it off. Probably business-related, they said. That word, probably, became their favorite excuse. His phone was found a month later, abandoned near the river, screen cracked, battery dead. No fingerprints, no signs of struggle, just silence. Every piece of evidence they found seemed to erase him a little more. I remember the detective's face. Polite, distant, tired. I could tell he'd already moved on to his next case. I didn't. His absence became part of the house, in the quiet rooms, in the way I'd still cook 2 portions without realizing, in the way the mail piled up near the door with his name on it. Every letter felt like a ghost tapping on the glass. Sometimes I'd pick up the phone just to hear the tone, just to remember what it sounded like when he used to call. I started keeping a small notebook. Each day, I'd write a single line, a clue, a thought, a memory. It became my way of surviving. The police had their reports, but I had my truth. He didn't leave me by choice. And then came the box. That brown box, now sitting in front of me, felt like a heartbeat. Small, steady, alive. I couldn't stop thinking about the handwriting on the label. It was his. I knew every loop, every tilt of his letters. He had always written like he was in a hurry, words leaning forward as if they couldn't wait to exist. I ran my fingers across the letters again. If he had sent this, it meant he was alive. If someone else had, it meant something far darker. I placed the folded note from inside the box beside his old photograph. I looked at it for a long time. That single line, "Trust only the key," echoed in my head. What key? What was he asking me to find? And why now? That night, I didn't sleep. The clock ticked louder than usual, each sound pulling me deeper into thought. By dawn, I had already made up my mind. If the world had stopped looking for him, I hadn't. If the law had forgotten his name, I would remind them. When the first light broke through the curtains, I packed a small bag, his photo, the box, and the note. I had no idea where to begin, but I had something I hadn't had in months: direction. They said grief fades. They were wrong. It transforms. It becomes motion. And that morning, it carried me to the one place where his handwriting had pointed, toward the key. The box sat in front of me like a quiet threat. I could feel its weight through the table, not from what it contained, but from what it might mean. I had faced many nights alone since my son vanished, but this one was different. The air felt dense, as if the house itself was holding its breath. It was a simple thing: brown cardboard, sealed with one strip of tape. No logos, no labels, no fingerprints but mine. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me through it, waiting for me to open it and see what kind of truth it held. My mind raced through every possibility. What if it wasn't really from him? What if someone else used his name? I remembered the detective's warning months ago. Scammers prey on hope. He'd said it with a kind of tired sympathy, like he'd seen too many mothers like me. But this wasn't a random message or an email. This was his handwriting, my son's. The way his letters tilted slightly to the right. The way the ink always faded near the end of each word. You can't forge a rhythm like that. Still, my hands trembled. The sound of the clock ticking grew louder. I told myself I was being silly. It was just a box. But something in me knew better. Grief sharpens your instincts. It teaches you to hear danger in silence, to recognize memory by weight alone. I picked up the box and turned it gently in my hands. It was heavier than I expected. There was a faint clink inside, metal brushing against something solid. My stomach knotted. What if it was something terrible? A final message from someone who knew what happened to him? What if this was how I learned my son's fate? I pressed my ear against the side, listening. Nothing. Just the faint rustle of paper. The air was cold, and my fingers felt numb. I reached for the knife again, the same one I'd used earlier. The blade slid easily under the tape. The sound, slow, tearing, echoed like a whisper through the empty kitchen. When the tape gave way, the smell hit me. Dust, old air, and something faintly metallic. I folded the flaps back slowly, half afraid of what I might see. Inside, layers of paper, folded with care. Not newspaper or plastic. Plain, old stationery paper, yellowed slightly at the edges. The kind he used to write notes on when he was a boy. My breath caught. For a moment, I saw him again. The little boy who used to write me notes before school. "Mum, don't forget your umbrella. Mum, I fed the cat." Now here I was, 40 years later, holding another note. But I didn't open it yet. My eyes caught something else. A glint of metal. I pushed the paper aside and saw a small silver key. It was simple, unmarked, but attached to a keychain engraved with 2 letters, MG, his initials. My throat tightened. I lifted it out, cold metal pressing into my palm. It felt heavier than it should. Underneath it, a small flash drive wrapped in tissue paper, carefully folded, protected. That was when I realized this wasn't random. It was deliberate, planned. And then finally, I saw the folded note. The handwriting unmistakable. My son's, again. The letters were sharp, hurried, written like someone who didn't have much time. My heart pounded as I unfolded it. The words were few, but they struck harder than anything I'd ever read. "Mum, if you're reading this, trust only the key." I froze. That was it. No explanations, no goodbyes, just those words. The knife slipped from my hand and clattered onto the table. I stared at the paper, reading it again and again, hoping for more, for something hidden in the lines. Nothing, just that one instruction. I turned the key in my hand. What could it possibly open? A door? A safe? A secret I wasn't meant to find until now? A strange calm began to replace the fear, because in that moment, I understood something. This wasn't the end of my son's story. He was guiding me toward something he couldn't tell anyone else. I sat there for hours, watching the key glint under the kitchen light, the note beside it. The box empty, but heavy with meaning. Dawn crept in slowly, painting the floor with pale gold. I hadn't slept, but I didn't need to. Because for the first time in 6 months, I had something I hadn't felt in a long, long time. Direction. He wasn't gone. Not yet. The morning light crept slowly across the table, catching the edge of the silver key. It shimmered faintly, the way sunlight hits still water. Quiet, but alive. I hadn't slept a minute, but exhaustion didn't matter anymore. That key wasn't random. My son had sent it for a reason. I poured myself a cup of tea, though my hands were too unsteady to drink it. My eyes kept returning to the box, to the folded note that sat beside it, like a heartbeat frozen in paper. Trust only the key. It wasn't fear now. It was curiosity, sharp and urgent. He was trying to tell me something, and every second I hesitated felt like I was betraying him again, by waiting. I examined the keychain closely. It wasn't new. The metal was slightly tarnished, edges worn smooth. There were tiny scratches near the base, as if it had been in someone's pocket for a long time. But then I saw it. 2 small engraved letters, MG. His initials. Beneath them, a faint emblem. A circle with a lock symbol inside. I recognized it instantly. It belonged to a private storage company. One that my husband had used years ago to keep old business files. It was the kind of place that required physical keys for access, not just passcodes. The logo had been burned into my memory from the day I'd accompanied him there decades ago, long before our son was born. A company known for secrecy. I checked the flash drive next. I didn't plug it in. Not yet. My laptop was old, the kind that took minutes to load, and I wasn't ready to see what it might show. I didn't want to risk losing any information or worse, breaking something important. I decided to focus on what I could follow: the key. The nearest branch of that storage company was on the other side of the city. It opened at sunrise, and I didn't want to wait any longer. I grabbed my coat, tucked the key and the note into my pocket, and left the house. The early air was crisp, almost biting. Mist hung over the streets, soft and heavy. The city still slept, unaware that one mother was chasing a ghost. When I arrived, the building looked the same as I remembered. Gray concrete walls, metal shutters, no sign of life except a flickering light near the entrance. A man in a uniform sat behind the desk, half asleep, flipping through a logbook. I hesitated before approaching. What if the key didn't fit? What if this wasn't the right place at all? But the moment I handed him the key, his expression changed. He sat up straight, squinting at the engraving. "Unit 47, he murmured. He checked the register, then looked at me. "You have authorization?" I nodded slowly. "It belonged to my family," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He stared for a moment, then shrugged, unlocking the inner gate. "It's still active," he said quietly. The hallway smelled of old metal and dust. Rows upon rows of identical units stretched before me, their locks glinting faintly under the fluorescent lights. My footsteps echoed, 1, 2, 3, until I stopped in front of the small metal door marked 47. For a few seconds, I just stood there. The key felt warm in my hand, as though it had been waiting. I pushed it into the lock. It fit perfectly, turning with a quiet click. The door creaked open, the air inside dry and still. What I saw inside made my chest tighten. Stacks of folders, neatly arranged on metal shelves, a black camera bag, several sealed envelopes marked with red ink, and on top of everything, a small framed photo. My son, smiling, standing beside a man I hadn't seen in years, my husband's old business partner, the same man who had vanished after my husband's death. I reached for the nearest folder. It was labeled Financial Records, 2018-2020. Inside were pages of documents, bank transfers, property papers, receipts, all in my husband's handwriting. But something was wrong. There were signatures that didn't match, company stamps that looked forged, and bank accounts I'd never heard of. I opened another folder. This one contained photos, blurred images of meetings, contracts being exchanged, and my son standing near the same man holding files, his expression serious. The last picture was dated 2 days before he disappeared. Then I saw it. A small envelope with my name written on it. My hands shook as I tore it open. Inside was another note, shorter this time. "Mom, they'll try to bury this. If you get this, it means they already have. Don't trust anyone connected to Dad's old business. Start here. The camera will explain the rest." I looked at the camera resting in the corner. My heart pounded. He had left me his truth, one piece at a time. Whatever had taken him wasn't random. It was planned, deliberate. And somewhere inside this storage room was the reason he'd vanished. I took a deep breath, clutching the camera. I didn't know where this trail would lead, but one thing was certain. My son hadn't disappeared. He'd been silenced. The camera sat in my lap like a confession waiting to be heard. Its surface was cold, worn at the corners, with a faint scratch along the lens, as if it had been used in a hurry. I stared at it, uncertain whether I was holding a clue or a curse. Every instinct in me screamed to stop, to let the past remain buried. But that key, that box, that note, none of them would have found their way to me by accident. I pressed the power button. The screen flickered weakly, the battery nearly dead. I searched the storage locker shelves for a charger, and after rummaging through a few boxes, I found one tucked beside an old extension cord. I plugged it in, watching the red light blink to life. The camera hummed softly, as though exhaling after being silent for too long. When the menu appeared, I scrolled through the files. There were dozens of short clips, all recorded within a few weeks of each other, the dates leading right up to the week my son disappeared. My hands tightened around the camera as I pressed play on the first one. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to see faces. My son stood in what looked like a small office. Papers covered the desk. His voice was low but firm, and though I couldn't hear every word, I could catch phrases. Dad's partner, forged transfers, insurance money. He looked tired, older than I remembered, as if carrying something heavier than guilt. The next few clips were worse. Meetings in dimly lit places, men shaking hands, cash envelopes sliding across tables. The partner's face appeared more than once, his smile sharp and false. My son was recording them secretly, from a distance, from corners, through reflections in glass. One clip made my heart stop. It showed my son sitting in his car at night. He whispered to the camera, voice trembling. "If anything happens to me," he said, "Mom, the key will find you." Then the screen went black. I paused the video and sat there in the silence that followed. He'd known his life was in danger, and still, he'd gone through with it. He had risked everything. For me, for truth, for the life my husband had built on half-truths and shadows. I rewound the clip, pressing my hand to the screen as if I could reach through time. "You're not gone," I whispered under my breath. "You left me a map." I looked around the storage unit again. The folders, the files, the recordings. Everything pointed toward one man, my husband's old partner. I remembered him well. He had been charming in public, but always avoided my eyes in private. I'd once caught him whispering with my husband late at night, their voices sharp and secretive. When my husband died, the partner disappeared within a month. No one questioned it. I hadn't either. Now the puzzle began to form. My husband had built his business on promises, but his partner had twisted those promises into lies. My son must have discovered it and tried to stop it. I took the USB drive from the box, slid it into my laptop, and opened the files. Hundreds of documents appeared. Some were spreadsheets of financial transactions. Others were scanned letters and legal contracts. I opened one at random. A transfer of a large sum to an offshore account under a company name I didn't recognize. The signature at the bottom wasn't my husband's. It was forged, badly. The next file contained emails between the partner and another associate discussing removal of someone interfering with their plans. My breath caught at one line. "The boy's asking too many questions. Handle it quietly." The boy. My son. The room tilted. I gripped the table to steady myself. My son had vanished because he'd uncovered everything. And now, through this camera and this key, he was telling me what the world refused to see. I backed up every file to a new folder, naming it Truth. Then I locked the camera, the drive, and the documents back in the box. This time, I wasn't hiding them. I was protecting them until I could find someone who would listen. Someone who wouldn't close the file and say, "You're not supposed to be here." Before I left, I glanced around the storage room one last time. Dust floated through the air, catching light from the ceiling lamp. My son had walked into danger alone. But now, he wasn't alone anymore. I closed the locker door, turned the key, and slipped it back into my pocket. It was warm against my skin, almost alive. He'd said to trust the key. I finally understood why. It didn't just unlock a door. It unlocked the truth. The box sat open on my kitchen table once again, its contents spread before me like a map of betrayal. The morning sun filtered through the window, but it felt too bright for the things I was uncovering. I had thought the key would lead to closure. Instead, it led me straight into a truth I was never supposed to find. I began sorting everything by date. The oldest papers were from the time when my husband's business was just beginning. The same years we struggled to pay for our son's schooling, when I sold my wedding jewelry to help keep the doors open. Each page I touched was like reopening an old wound, but the deeper I went, the more I realized how deep the deception ran. At first, the documents looked ordinary: contracts, receipts, partnership agreements. But the numbers didn't add up. Transfers appeared under companies that didn't exist. Transactions moved through offshore accounts, and several pages bore my husband's signature, written in a hand that wasn't quite his. My son had circled them in red ink. I followed each mark as though he were guiding my eyes across the paper from wherever he was. Then I found something that stopped me cold. A folder labeled Insurance Payouts, Private. Inside, an agreement between my husband and his business partner, transferring policy benefits to a third account. The signature line for my husband was dated 2 days before he died. 2 days. I sat back in my chair, my hands shaking. I remembered the night before he passed, how he'd complained of chest pain but refused to see a doctor, how his partner had stopped by the house earlier that same day. For the first time in my life, I felt a chill not of grief, but of suspicion. The camera footage confirmed it. Clip after clip, my son had recorded secret meetings, phone calls, and evidence of financial manipulation. In one video, the partner was speaking angrily into a phone, saying, "If she finds out, it all collapses." She. He was talking about me. Another clip showed my son sitting in his car again, whispering into the recorder. His voice was calm but tense. "Mum," he said, "Dad's partner's been using false documents for years. He moved the money into fake accounts and framed me when I found out. If I disappear, it's because I got too close." The world spun around me. I paused the video and pressed my hand over my mouth. My son hadn't run away. He hadn't abandoned me. He'd been hunted by the very man my husband had trusted most. I pressed play again. The next few seconds showed the partner meeting someone at a cafe. The sound was faint, but one phrase slipped through. "The mother doesn't know anything." I did now. I grabbed a notebook and began to list every name, every bank account, every date. I could feel the pieces aligning: my husband's sudden death, my son's disappearance, the silent accounts hidden in plain sight. They had planned to keep me quiet, assuming I was too old, too fragile, too trusting to see beyond the lies. They underestimated a mother. That afternoon, I went to a print shop and made copies of everything: the photos, the videos, the contracts. I kept the originals locked in my kitchen drawer and carried one flash drive in my handbag. I wasn't going to confront anyone yet. Not until I was ready. Back home, I re-watched the last clip again. My son's face filled the small screen, tired but steady. "Mum," he said softly, "if you get this, don't cry. Just finish what I started. Make it right." Tears blurred my vision, but there was no sadness left, only purpose. I opened a new folder on my laptop and named it Justice. Then I uploaded every file from the USB, the camera, and the papers I'd scanned. I made sure there were backups stored in the cloud under different names, hidden where no one could delete them. By nightfall, I had built what my son had died trying to build. A trail of proof too solid to bury. As I sat there in the quiet, the weight of truth pressed down on me. Not heavy like grief, but strong like armor. I didn't know if my son was alive. I didn't know if the man who destroyed our family was still watching me. But I did know one thing. They had tried to erase us with lies. Now, I would resurrect us with facts. I folded my son's note one last time and placed it in my wallet. It wasn't just paper, it was a promise. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind against the windows sounded like footsteps coming closer. Fear has a sound. Quiet, deliberate, like paper turning in the dark. But fear also has a limit, and that night, mine reached it. For months I had waited, prayed, begged for answers. Now they were sitting right in front of me, in neat stacks of files and evidence that my son had risked his life to protect. He hadn't vanished because he wanted to disappear. He'd vanished because he knew the truth could destroy powerful people. At dawn, I made tea, strong enough to stop my hands from shaking. Then I began again. I read every document, watched every video, and wrote every date down in a notebook. I wasn't reading as a mother anymore. I was reading as a witness. My son had gathered proof. My job was to turn that proof into justice. By the time the clock struck 9, I had made my decision. I couldn't go to the police, not yet. My husband's old partner had connections. He had money, influence, friends who could make evidence vanish before breakfast. I needed someone who couldn't be bought, someone who understood how the law worked in silence. I thought of an old friend, Daniel, a retired lawyer I had known from my teaching days. We hadn't spoken in years, but I remembered his calm, patient manner and the way he always believed in facts over faces. I found his number in an old phone book and dialed it. My voice trembled as I spoke, but his tone was steady. "Bring everything," he said, "and bring no one with you." By mid-morning, I was sitting in his small, cluttered office, the box between us. He put on his glasses and began to go through the papers one by one. Minutes turned into hours. He didn't speak until he had seen everything: the photos, the USB drive, the insurance papers, and the letter from my son. When he finally looked up, his face was pale. "Do you understand what this means?" he asked. I nodded. He leaned back in his chair. "This isn't just fraud. This is conspiracy. And if the evidence is real, your son might still be in danger." The words hit me like a gust of cold air. But fear didn't paralyze me this time. It fueled me. "What do we do?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "We start where he left off, quietly." Daniel spent the next few days reviewing the files. I stayed with him, helping where I could, bringing coffee, typing notes, cross-checking statements. Together we built a timeline of deceit that stretched over 15 years. My husband's partner had siphoned millions through fake contracts, bribed officials, and filed forged insurance claims. My husband's death had been the final piece, the natural cause that sealed their success. But then, something remarkable happened. As we dug deeper, Daniel found a pattern of small deposits made into a hidden account, one in my son's name. The latest deposit had been made only a few weeks ago. He wasn't gone. He was alive somewhere, hidden. And whoever had made those deposits was trying to keep him that way. I pressed my hands together, whispering a silent thank you. He had found a way to reach me even when the world thought he was lost. Daniel contacted a detective he trusted, one known for integrity, not influence. We didn't tell anyone else, not the family, not the neighbors, not even close friends. The fewer who knew, the safer we were. By the end of the week, we had enough to file a formal case. The evidence was airtight. Video footage, bank transfers, and signed confessions hidden within business logs. Daniel arranged for a private courier to deliver the files to the district office under seal, ensuring no one could intercept them. The night before the submission, I sat by my window watching the rain. The streetlights glowed softly, their reflections stretching across the wet pavement. I thought of my son, of his laughter, his stubbornness, his quiet strength. He had faced something far greater than either of us could imagine, and yet he had trusted me to finish it. For the first time in months, I didn't feel powerless. I didn't feel like a grieving mother waiting for the world to hand her peace. I was the one creating it. By morning, the papers were filed. The truth was out of my hands now, but in safe ones. The silence in my home didn't scare me anymore. It comforted me. It meant the lies had finally lost their voice. That day, I understood something my son must have known all along. Courage doesn't mean the absence of fear. It means choosing to act despite it. And that's exactly what I had done. The day the storm broke was quiet at first. Too quiet, almost polite, as though the world was holding its breath before the noise began. I woke up early, brewed a pot of tea, and sat at the kitchen table staring at the clock. Each minute ticked with the weight of everything I'd been carrying. The secrets, the fear, the endless silence. But today, silence wasn't my enemy. It was my weapon. By mid-morning, the phone rang. It was Daniel. His voice was calm, steady, but I could hear the undercurrent of tension. "It's happening," he said. "They're moving in." I didn't need to ask who they were. Within an hour, 2 police cars rolled down the street and stopped outside my late husband's old office building, the one that had once been the pride of our family name. The air outside smelled of rain and old concrete, and I stood by my gate watching as officers went inside carrying sealed warrants. Across the street, neighbors peeked through their curtains. Gossip was already forming like smoke before the fire even started. Then I saw him, my husband's former partner, the man whose face had haunted my nightmares and whose name had poisoned every memory of trust I'd ever had. He stepped out of a black car, confident at first, still wrapped in the arrogance of men who believe they'll never be caught. But the moment he saw the badges, the files, and the cameras flashing, his face drained of color. Justice doesn't need volume. Sometimes it's just the sound of handcuffs clicking shut. I didn't speak to him. I didn't need to. I watched as he was led out in front of the building, his head down, trying to hide from the truth that finally found him. Every secret he'd buried under contracts, every forged document, every cruel decision that had cost me my husband's life and my son's peace, all of it was being unearthed in daylight. Later that day, I sat beside Daniel in the courtroom. The walls smelled faintly of varnish and dust, and the air was thick with anticipation. The partner's lawyer tried to argue that the documents were fabricated, that my husband had authorized every transfer. But Daniel rose to speak, holding up the same folder I'd found in that cold storage unit. His voice didn't shake once. He laid out the proof 1 page at a time. The unsigned seals, the altered handwriting, the audio recordings. Then came the videos, the ones my son had risked everything to film. The room fell silent as the projector screen lit up. My son's voice filled the court, calm but trembling, as he described the fraud, the lies, and the danger. The judge leaned forward. The partner's defense faltered. When the final video ended, no one moved. I felt tears pressing behind my eyes, but they didn't fall. I wasn't sad anymore. I was proud. My son had spoken, even when the world thought he was gone. When the verdict came, it wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, almost respectful. Guilty on all counts. Embezzlement, fraud, forgery, conspiracy. The man who had once stood beside my husband as a friend would now stand behind bars as a criminal. But that wasn't the end. 2 days later, Daniel called again, this time with news that nearly took my breath away. During the investigation, one of the frozen accounts revealed new activity. Deposits made under my son's identification number. Authorities traced the source. A private witness protection fund tied to the reopened fraud case. It meant only one thing. My son was alive. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I felt my body go still, the world pausing around me. Alive. The word didn't even sound real. I'd buried my grief so deep I'd forgotten what hope felt like. And now it was returning, quietly, like dawn after the longest night. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings, confirmations, and paperwork. When the final report arrived, it confirmed what Daniel had suspected. My son had been placed under protective custody months earlier, after contacting investigators with the same evidence I now held. He'd stayed hidden while the case built strength, unable to risk exposure. And that box, that midnight delivery, had been his way of reaching me without putting me in danger. That evening, I walked out into the garden and watched the sky fade into gold. The air smelled of rain again, and for the first time in years it didn't feel heavy. It felt clean. Justice had unfolded, not with noise, but with proof. Not with revenge, but with truth. Somewhere out there, my son was waiting for the world to be safe again. And now, thanks to what we'd done, it finally was. The day my son returned began like any other. Quiet, uneventful, unremarkable. I was watering the small garden behind my cottage, the one I'd rebuilt after losing everything. The air was cool, the soil damp beneath my fingers, and for the first time in a long while, I was content with the stillness. I had learned to live without waiting, or at least I thought I had. Then came the sound. Soft footsteps on the gravel path, hesitant but familiar. My hands froze mid-motion. When I turned, I saw him. He was thinner, his face sharper, his eyes older. But the way he stood, the same posture, the same uncertain half-smile, it was him. My son. The boy I thought I'd lost. Now a man carved by pain and silence, standing a few feet away from me as though time had folded in on itself. For a moment, neither of us moved. The world around us felt suspended, like even the wind was afraid to disturb what was happening. Then, without a word, he stepped forward, and I walked to him. We met in the middle of the path, and I touched his face as though he were made of glass. His skin was warm, real, alive. I didn't cry right away. I just looked at him, at the lines of exhaustion, the faint scars along his hands, the shadows under his eyes. He looked like someone who had lived several lives in one. When my tears finally came, they weren't the tears of grief I'd been shedding for months. They were the kind that heal instead of hurt. He explained slowly, quietly, as we sat on the bench under the old tree. How he'd discovered the fraud years ago and gone to the authorities. How they told him to vanish while the investigation unfolded. How he'd tried to send me messages, the letter, the deposits, the box, but had to stay away so no one would trace him back. I listened, my hands clasped around his, afraid to let go. Each word felt like sunlight breaking through the dark clouds that had covered my world. I realized then that every sleepless night, every unanswered prayer, every moment I had doubted his love, they had all been wrong. My son had never left me. He had been fighting for me. We stayed there for hours just talking about the past, the loss, and the things we wished we could forget. But beneath it all, there was forgiveness. Not spoken, just understood. Some wounds don't need apologies. They need presence. Later, as evening settled in, I brought out 2 plates and a simple meal: soup, bread, and tea. It felt like a ritual, like we were reclaiming something small but sacred. When he smiled at the taste, I saw a glimpse of the boy he once was, the boy who used to laugh over burnt toast and call me his best friend. After dinner, he reached into his jacket and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. "I kept it safe," he said. Inside was the old family photo, the one we'd taken years ago when life was still kind. My husband's smile, my younger face, and our son, arms around us both. The glass was cracked, but the picture itself was untouched. I placed it on the table beside the lamp. "We've lost so much," I said softly, "but this is enough." He nodded, eyes glistening. "It's all I wanted to fix." That night, as he slept in the spare room, his old room, still smelling faintly of dust and memory, I stood in the doorway watching him breathe. The same peaceful rhythm from when he was a boy. For the first time in years, I didn't feel empty. I didn't feel haunted. I felt home. I realized then that justice hadn't just freed us from lies. It had given us back the chance to live without fear. The law had punished the guilty, yes. But what mattered most was this: the bond between a mother and her son had survived everything money, power, and deceit tried to destroy. As the moonlight spilled through the window, I whispered to myself, a quiet prayer, not of hope, but of gratitude. Because sometimes the story doesn't end when the truth comes out. Sometimes it ends when love walks back through the door, thinner, older, but unbroken. And that night, in the stillness of my home, that's exactly what happened. Morning came quietly. The kind of morning that doesn't announce itself, just slips in through the curtains and reminds you that life goes on. My son was still asleep. The world outside was calm, the air soft with the smell of rain-soaked soil. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, the same way I had for countless mornings before. But this time, it felt different. The silence that once felt like punishment now sounded like peace. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of survival, of truth, of everything I had endured and finally overcome. I looked at the small box still resting on the shelf. The same box that had arrived at my door in the middle of the night, heavy with fear, heavy with secrets. I used to think that box carried my heartbreak. Now I realized it had carried my second chance. It made me wonder how many people live their whole lives waiting for closure, not knowing that sometimes it doesn't arrive wrapped in comfort. Sometimes it knocks at 3 a.m., uninvited, cold, and terrifying. But if you're brave enough to open it, it might carry the thing you've been searching for all along: truth. When I think about everything that happened, the deceit, the silence, the fear, I don't feel hatred anymore. Hatred is loud, but healing is quiet. My husband's betrayal, the partner's greed, the months of confusion and grief, they all became chapters of a story I never planned to write but had to live through. What saved me wasn't revenge. It wasn't even justice, though justice had its place. What saved me was persistence. The quiet, stubborn refusal to accept that lies could win. The world can take away money, homes, and names, but it can't take away a mother's will to uncover the truth for her child. I thought of my son again, asleep just a few rooms away. How close I had come to losing him forever. How the world had told me to give up, to move on, to let grief settle where hope once lived. But hope doesn't die quietly. It lingers, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. That's what I wanted people to understand. That's why I decided to share this story. Not for sympathy, but as proof. Proof that age doesn't make you powerless. Proof that silence can be strength. Proof that justice, no matter how late it arrives, always finds the truth it's owed. We spend so much of our lives believing that the end of something, a marriage, a loss, a disappearance, means the end of us. But I've learned that every ending is just an invitation to begin again, differently. Maybe more quietly, maybe more cautiously, but always stronger. I sipped my tea, watching the sunlight scatter across the floor, and thought about all the women like me, mothers, wives, grandmothers, who carry stories too heavy for others to believe. Women who are told to stay quiet, to endure, to accept what's been done to them. I hope they hear me now when I say this. You are never too old, too weak, or too late to fight for your truth. Because truth doesn't belong to the young or the powerful. It belongs to those who keep standing after everything else has fallen apart. When my son woke later that morning, he joined me by the window. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. He reached over, poured himself a cup, and sat beside me, the same way he used to as a boy. The light caught his face, and for the first time, I saw peace there too. I placed my hand over his and said quietly in my heart, "We made it." Now, when people ask me about that night, the knock at 3 a.m., the fear, the mystery, I just smile. Because that knock didn't bring me terror. It brought me truth. And if truth ever comes to your door, even when it's dark, even when you're afraid, open it. Don't wait for daylight. Don't wait for permission. Because sometimes the things that scare you most are the very things that will save you. So I'll leave you with this. The lawyer's files, the courtroom, the arrests, they were all part of the story. But the real ending was much quieter. It was a mother sitting by her window, her son safe beside her, the world finally honest again. He once sent me a box full of secrets. I turned it into a life full of peace. Tell me, if truth knocked on your door tonight, would you open it or pretend to sleep?